Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience in their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's Libsyn, ads.com today.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Crimelines, which honestly half of my audience is probably going to skip, but that's okay. I'd be lying if I didn't admit that I sometimes skip these episodes when I see them pop up in other podcast feeds because it really depends on the podcast and how deep I am into my parasocial relationship with that podcaster. This is a 2024 year in review and a look at what's coming up in 2025. So hello to those who want to hear a little bit about the behind the scenes of the podcast and a little bit about what is going on in my life that impacts the podcast. I have a few notes so I can stay organized, but mostly this is just off the cuff. And I need to say that this year has been pretty interesting. And pretty much everything big that happened this year is somewhat interconnected. Let's start with not doing the 12 Days of Crimelines. The issue came down to time. I'm sure it's obvious that I can't do all of that work in December, and I work on it throughout the year. I generally come across shorter cases that I think will make good episodes and get them to at least the rough draft stage before I put them aside for the 12 days. But this year with Crimelines, I was putting out more content than usual. For the last couple of years, I was only doing 3 episodes a month and 2 shorter Patreon episodes, but now I'm doing 4 full episodes a month on Crimelines, and then those shorter Patreon episodes are now Beyond the Files, which are often as long as a regular Crimelines episode. It really is another podcast. I also used to have help on the show that I don't have any longer. Aside from occasionally working with Haley Gray Research on a case she's advocating for, I'm making my show start to finish by myself. I did have an editor for a little while, but that was a cutback I made when something big happened in my personal life. And that is that my husband quit his job. It is a long story on why he quit, but we decided that this could be his chance to build out his own projects. I was able to get into podcasting because he was working to support us, and now I can give him some of that same time to try to launch his own thing. But he made more money than me, and not by a little, so it has meant some budgetary cutbacks, and hiring help with the podcast was one of the first things to go. Trust me, no one over here is going without, and woe is me that I have to do my dream job every day. I mean, I promise I'm not complaining about any of this, but rather explaining where the spare time for the 12 Days of Crimelines went. There is more content throughout the year, plus I don't have help on the show. That's the long and short of it. At least half of the episodes you heard for the December bonus episodes were researched back in January and February of 2024 when I still had time to work on them. And I'm also starting to appreciate that it's not just the time commitment of the podcast. I mean, it's mostly the time commitment, let's be honest, but there is also an emotional component. True crime content is hard. If you are sitting with a case that I recorded and you're listening for 45 minutes, you have to know that I spent at least 20 hours on it. Sometimes more, but never less. That's a lot of time to sit in a tragedy. So when I have downtime, I really don't want to do more true crime. I spend my downtime reading books that are not true crime. I make TikToks occasionally about reality TV shows I'm watching, or I subject my family to some new recipe I found on the internet. That is where I can invest my extra time and energy right now, and not in doing more episodes of Crimelines. So going into 2025, I have found that I do have thoughts on cases that don't necessarily fit into the episodes, and so I am writing those down to hopefully start doing more social media content in 2025 that include additional thoughts, maybe some opinions on content that I've already created on Crimelines, But other than that, I don't really foresee any big changes next year. We have 4 episodes a month, which you can hear free in any app and just deal with the ads, or you can get on Patreon, Apple subscriptions, or Supercast and get them all ad-free, plus you get the 2 episodes of Beyond the Files each month. The cost of the subscription is about $5. It depends on where you're located because they're factoring things like exchange rates if you're not in the US, and then sometimes you can get taxed or surcharged or VATed or whatever the other ways people are taking cuts of money. I charge only $5 for this because I do recognize I am not Netflix, and I'm not going to charge you more than what I am willing to pay another podcast for the same thing. And I think this is a pretty good place to then talk about the ads you are hearing on Crimelines if you are not paying me $5 a month. If you have been listening to podcasts for probably 5 or 6 years, maybe even longer, you might have noticed how many more ads pretty much all podcasts have these days. I know it's not popular to point it out, and if you mention it in a podcast group, you're probably going to hear something like, "Don't you want your favorite creators to make money?" But I think the issue isn't that people don't want podcasters to make money, but there has just been a big change in the frequency of ads in the last few years, and there's been no explanation to the listeners as to why. So I am here to tell you the why. The industry standards are changing, and I can tell you that we have to run more ads to make the same amount of money that we used to make. The standard used to be 2 ad breaks per episode with 2 ads playing in the first break and 1 ad at the second. And that was for a 45-minute episode. Some people also would run 1 or 2 ads at the very beginning of the episode before it even starts, and then 1 or 2 at the very end. Those are called pre-roll and post-roll ads. Pretty much everyone is running those now. But when we talk about mid-roll ads, the ones that break up the episode in the middle of you listening, if we're talking a 45-minute episode, you might have 2 ads playing at 1 ad break, 1 at the second, and that was it. But now you'll have a 30-minute episode that has 2 ads at the beginning, 2 breaks with 3 ads each, and then 2 or 3 more ads at the end. I don't know that we have an industry standard anymore, but it's definitely moving towards having ads at the beginning and the end, plus having 1 ad break per 10 minutes of content with 2 to 3 ads per break. That is much more in line with radio, TV, and YouTube, so I definitely see why things are going that way, even if as a listener, it is annoying. For a long time, I was pretty resistant to this change, and I was using the old formula of 2 ad breaks. And then I started doing just 1 ad break unless the episode was an hour long or more, then I'll add a second. But again, that's when my husband was working his fancy corporate job, and I didn't need to bring in as much income to pay the bills. But it was also when Crimelines appeared to have a lot more listeners than it did, so I made the same money with 1 ad break as I do with 2 ad breaks now. And to explain this, it's not that I've lost listeners, though. I mean, I could have lost listeners that I have not replaced. That's definitely possible. It's harder now to compete for listeners against the big networks and the celebrity shows. But that doesn't explain the bulk of the drop in numbers. What happened is that major podcast apps have been changing what counts as a listen or a download to the point that everyone's numbers across the board have dropped. If I even tried to discuss this topic on mic with other podcasters, I would have to bleep half of the episode. It has been a huge blow to us. So if it looked like you had 50,000 listeners 2 years ago, your numbers are probably more like 30,000 today because of these changes. So that means ad payments are down this 30 to 40% as well. And some are even more. My downloads per episode are about half what they were before all of these changes. The thing is, advertisers knew back then that there was bloat in the numbers, and that some people were auto-downloading episodes without ever actually listening, and we would still get counted for those. So advertisers were paying knowing that they were getting fewer impressions than were being reported. But once they ended up getting these hard numbers that were reflecting the actual number of downloads and listens, they cut their rates to match the new numbers. So just imagine waking up one day and getting a 30% pay cut because Apple changed one feature in their app in regards to auto downloads. That is literally what happened. I mean, you can help me out by making sure you play all of the episodes, even if you're not actively listening to them. But if you're listening to this episode, you're probably the type who already listens to most of my episodes every week anyway, so it doesn't matter. But you can tell your friends to listen to my podcast because that also helps. But basically, you have been hearing more ads on Crimelines this year, and it's a combination between the nature of the industry, but also my life circumstances of having to make an income. When my husband makes his millions on his own business, we'll cut back on the ads again, but until that happens, you do have to expect that I'm going to have ads at the beginning and the end of the episodes, plus an ad break per 20 minutes of content, spaced evenly in the episode. That is still half of what a lot of people do, but I know it can be annoying to suddenly hear a podcast you're used to not having a lot of ads, having more ads. So I hope that makes sense, even if it makes my episodes more annoying. So let's change gears a bit because I wanted to talk about the future of Beyond the Files, which is the show where I take Forensic Files episodes and I tell the rest of the story. And it is currently exclusive on Apple, Patreon, and Supercast for $5 a month. That price will not change in 2025, and if you subscribe at that rate now, it will be locked in case I do in 2026 increase it. And if I increased it, it would be $1 or $2 more a month just to kind of keep up with these grocery prices. I've got a lot of people to feed, but for 2025, it's still going to be $5. I have had a few people, and by few, I mean literally 3. I'm not going to pretend that the masses are demanding anything of me, but these 3 people have asked if Beyond the Files will ever be released in the main feed with ads, and I do get why they're asking, because even though I do try to keep the fee low, there are tons of free podcasts out there, and I'm asking you to pay for something that you can get elsewhere for $0, just having to listen to some ads. And if you think about it, $5 a month is obviously $60 a year, and that could be a month of internet for someone or their phone bill. I don't take that lightly that I'm asking people for money. So the question is, will Beyond the Files ever be released to everyone? And the answer is maybe. But not anytime soon. If I did it, I would not do it until I had 2 years worth of episodes, and right now, I have 7 months. People are paying to get these episodes, not just ad-free, but to have them as exclusive content. So I wouldn't feel great about turning around and releasing them publicly a year later. But I have been torn on it because, as you know, I have stopped putting unsolved cases behind a paywall for ethical reasons, and I am working in 2025 to redo all of those old Patreon episodes that are unsolved and put new up-to-date versions in the public Crimelines feed. So I thought that the Forensic Files episodes are all solved, so I would not run into that problem. But I have been learning just how many of those convictions have either been overturned or have questionable convictions and are essentially now unsolved cases. So I do have to decide what to do about those. It doesn't really make sense to re-record something that I just recently covered, so do I just put the questionable conviction Beyond the Files episodes up publicly, or do I at some point just release the whole show in its own feed as its own thing? If Beyond the Files does get publicly released down the road, the episodes would still only come out one at a time, so Patreon and Apple subscribers will still be years ahead and will be getting the new releases. So there would still be some value there, but then I would have to figure out some other perk to give them because I can't have people paying me money monthly if they're not getting that much in return other than getting an episode 2 years early. I really have to put more thought into it, so putting it off is probably also me procrastinating, having to think about it. So this isn't a promise that the full show will be released publicly. It is the ultimate maybe. I have decided that this is a 2026 problem, and I'm still dealing with 2024 problems, Because in addition to resolving the 2024 problems, I also have a few 2025 problems, and they can be summed up with 1 month, and that is March. And what a privileged problem to have, because I am going to be traveling for 2 weeks at the beginning of the month, and then 1 week at the end of the month. The first is the trip to South America that I'm doing with Josh Hallmark and Lainey Hobbs. And there is still time to get in on that. You can still pay with Affirm and make payments, but you got to get on it pretty quick because it starts on February 27th. And so we will be closing it to new bookings pretty soon so that we can finalize details. The link has been in my show notes for a month, so just click it if you want to check out the trip. I will be gone longer than the 1 week trip because I'm adding days on either side of it. And that's because I'm already flying 20 hours to South America. I'm going to try to see as much as I can while I'm there. The second trip towards the end of the month is a spring break trip with my kids. And both of these trips that I'm going on were committed to and mostly paid for before my new budget kicked in. So I am definitely going to enjoy them since it'll be a while before I do any big trip. So from now until I leave, I'm going to be working very hard to get extra episodes prepped for March and April. And maybe that would be a good time for me to get some of the unsolved Patreon cases done that really should never have been put behind a paywall to begin with. Maybe I'll release 1 or 2 of the now technically unsolved Beyond the Files episodes into the public feed so people can hear those. And another option I have for March and April is to take some of the old episodes I have from my old podcast Insight that are unsolved and have updates and redo those. The truth is they're not really doing anything by being up on the Insight feed. Even if you search for the episode in a podcast app, they'll often not show up since the feed never gets updated. I can see the analytics on my end, and some of the episodes are getting maybe 10 listens a month, so they're really not doing anything for awareness to the unsolved cases. We also had a lot of episodes we covered back then that we had to delete, so I would have to re-research and write them from scratch, but since I have a basic understanding of the case, those come together a lot faster than episodes I'm not familiar with at all and I have to get caught up on and then do the research. You really have no idea how often I just read a little blurb on a case and decide to start researching it for Crimelines. And I don't even know where this happened, when it happened, who the key players are, if anyone was convicted, because I'm starting with a little headline or a blurb. Sometimes I'm learning about a case for the first time 2 weeks before you hear it on a podcast. So when I go into them with a base understanding, because I've already covered the case like on Insight, it does go a little faster and I can probably get those done a little bit more easily for March and April. I'm hoping not to take any time off even though I'm traveling. But if you wake up one Wednesday and there's no episode in March, just know it's probably because I ran out of time. So that's basically where we are with Crimelines and Beyond the Files. Where we were for the last half of 2024 is where we're going to continue into 2025, with the possible exception of March if I run out of time while traveling. But hopefully I will have episodes or back episodes or something to put out there so that you're not missing an episode. I think a good solid year of just focusing on Crimelines and building Beyond the Files will get me in a good spot to where maybe the show will grow after all of these blows to the numbers thanks to these podcast apps. And if it doesn't, I mean, I podcasted when I had a show in 2015 that got 50 listeners a week. Nobody was listening, and I was still cranking out my episodes. So I will continue to be making episodes whether I have 20,000 listeners, 50,000, 200,000. 200,000 would be great if you have 200,000 friends to tell about the show. I'd appreciate it. But if not, I'll still be here, and I hope you will be here still listening. And I think for 2025, I'm going to find comfort in the simplicity of my routine, of my schedule, and even of the new financial budget I find myself needing to engage in. Sometimes just keeping things easy, simple, and straightforward is where we need to be. But if there's a little prosperity around the corner, I certainly wouldn't say no to it. So with that, I want to say happy holidays and Happy New Year.